Hey folks, welcome to this lesson in the Certified DevOps Engineer Professional Level course. So in this section of the course, we're going to talk about auto-scaling deployment concepts. So using the DevOps doctrine, our interactive diagram, let's click auto-scaling deployment concepts. And we get to the section introductory page. Now, as a DevOps engineer, we will spend a great deal of our time creating, monitoring, and tuning auto-scaling groups. And we'll see they can be used in a variety of different ways, and understanding various use cases and proper configuration is a key skill set for a DevOps engineer. So in this section of the course, we'll quickly revisit the basics of auto-scaling, and we'll talk about termination policies, suspending auto-scaling processes, and we're going to spend a lot of time on lifecycle hooks. We'll talk about the various ways to interact with an auto-scaling group using the CLI, APIs, and SDKs. And we'll also talk about a very useful scenario where an auto-scaling group is scaling based on the size of an SQS queue. So looking at our diagram, everything we're talking about is going to interact or affect our auto-scaling group. SQS, the size of the SQS queue, will determine the size of our auto-scaling group. With lifecycle hooks, we can pause creation of EC2 instances while we do some custom actions. We can use termination policies to determine which EC2 instance to terminate when we scale down. And sometimes you're going to have to troubleshoot your auto-scaling group, and suspending processes is a good way to do this. But for now, in this lesson, let's look at an overview of auto-scaling deployment concepts. So when we have auto-scaling groups in our environment and we're involved in deployments, there's really a lot that can be going on with our auto-scaling group. Now we're going to kind of break things down one by one, and we'll see that it's really not overly complicated. And as we go through the course, we're going to build layers on top of this. We're going to be working with CloudFormation, Elastic Beanstalk, OpsWorks, but really having a thorough understanding of the basics of auto-scaling and the role of auto-scaling in deployments is going to provide a great foundation, not only for this course, but in your profession as a DevOps engineer. Now, oftentimes when we are doing deployments, we are going to want to avoid downtime. How can we assure that our auto-scaling group can be deployed in such a way as to avoid downtime? Well, we're not going to answer that question right now, but you can be sure that we will answer this question within this section of the course. Now, in a general sense, one way to avoid downtime is just to make sure that we are not delivering traffic to affected parts of our auto-scaling group. Now, this next question is a very crucial question to be asked when dealing with auto-scaling groups. How long to deploy code and configure an instance? And we'll see that there's a major timing component to launching instances in an auto-scaling group and deploying and configuring code on that instance. And this is where lifecycle hooks come into play. And we will go into great detail on lifecycle hooks in this section of the course. Another thing we can do is use CloudFormation init scripts to configure our new instances as they launch. And again, we will look into all of this throughout the lessons in this section of the course. Another good question to ask is, how do you test new launch configurations? And we will have a learning activity in an interactive lab environment, which is going to stress our auto-scaling group and help us test these configurations and the proper operation under stress. A great question to ask, and one we will certainly answer, is how do you phase out older launch configurations while phasing in newer configurations? So when dealing with auto-scaling and deployments, these are the types of questions you want to consider. Will certainly serve you well on the certification exam, but even more importantly, in the profession for DevOps engineers. Now, as we move forward in this section, we're going to be working a great deal with auto-scaling groups, and we're going to be talking about scaling out and scaling in. And of course, for scaling out, we're going to be launching new instances, and for scaling in, we are going to terminate instances. So in this lesson, I just want to give a general overview of what we're going to be doing in the section and cover some of the key terms. Now, while this course is going to be very interactive, although this lesson is more theory, let's go in anyway and create an auto-scaling group. So let's go into EC2, and we will start with a launch configuration, and we'll click Create Auto-Scaling Group. But you'll see the first step is to create the launch configuration, and let's select the Linux AMI, T2 Micro Free Tier Eligible. Let's configure details. Let's call our launch configuration DevOps Pro. Now, down the road in the course, we're going to be interacting with EC2 instances. We're going to launch these instances with an IAM role. In our launch configuration, let's select the IAM role S3 access for EC2. Now, a common use case is to be storing things in S3, and a convenient and, more importantly, highly secure way to access that data is via an IAM role. Now, one important thing in advanced details, well, two actually, let's talk about user data. Now, with lifecycle hooks, we're going to be plugging in a bash script in our user data to help configure our instances. But also in the IP address type, we want to select the radio button, assign a public IP address to every instance. So when these instances are launched, they're going to have a public IP address, and that's important to us because it will enable us to SSH into these instances. And we don't need to worry about storage. Let's skip to review, and let's click Create Launch Configuration. Let's create a key pair for our launch configuration, and let's call it DevOps Pro once again, and download key pair. And finally, we can create our launch configuration. All right, and now we can create the auto-scaling group. Let's call it DevOps Pro ASG. And let's start with 0 instances, and this will play a part in our lifecycle hooks lesson. Select a network and a subnet, and let's click Configure Scaling Policies. And again, let's keep the group at its initial size. And again, we'll get into that in the lifecycle hooks lesson. Let's click Review, Create Auto-Scaling Group. And really, we're just doing some groundwork here. We'll certainly edit this as we go along. Let's configure scaling policies. We're going to keep it at its initial size. This is going to play into our lifecycle hooks lesson. Let's click Review and Create Auto-Scaling Group. And note, we're pretty much creating a skeleton auto-scaling group for now. So we've successfully created our launch configuration and our auto-scaling group, which we will work with as we move throughout this section. So we've completed this lesson. Let's move on to the next.